Let's jump right into this explainer. We are looking at an absolute geopolitical earthquake today. We need to unpack the frankly stunning Memorandum of Understanding that was just signed by US President Donald Trump and Iranian President Pezeshkian. We're going to break down the mechanics of this deal, how it all happened, and explore what our sources are describing as a seriously ill-judged initial decision to attack back on February 28th. But right out of the gate, we're hit with this inescapable question. You see, the war initiated by the US and Israel took a massive human toll, leaving thousands of civilians dead in Iran and Lebanon. But when you look at the sheer, overwhelming military force applied, you kind of have to scratch your head and ask, what was the actual endgame here? And that brings us to the core paradox. The objective was clear, right? The world's strongest power, the US, and the Middle East superpower Israel launched a massive joint military operation. The goal was to literally cripple, if not entirely destroy, the Iranian regime. But the geopolitical reality? The regime didn't just survive the bombardment. They actually emerged empowered. So how does that even happen?
Section 1. The Economic Chokehold. How Iran Forced a Deal.
Well, it all comes down to geography and leverage. After the former supreme leader and his closest advisors were killed in those initial bombing sorties, the Iranian successors treated the conflict as an absolute existential struggle. They didn't hesitate for a second. They immediately shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And honestly, pulling that economic lever proved far cheaper and infinitely more devastating than using any proxy network. Because here's the crucial number: 1/5, 20%. Choking off 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supply is an unbelievably powerful weapon. Closing the strait was practically an easy move for Iran, but the global impact was rapid and honestly catastrophic. It threatened markets with a worldwide recession. That is a threat that hits all of us, right in the wallet.
Section 2. The Surprising Peace Deal. Inducements and Status Quo.
So, that sheer, overwhelming economic threat, it literally forced everyone to the negotiating table. And just look at the massive inducements Iran secured simply to reopen the strait. The MOU calls for an end to the war in Lebanon, something Israel fiercely opposes, by the way. Plus, the US will lift its counter-blockade on Iranian ports, waive sanctions so Iran can pull in billions from oil exports, and even start unfreezing foreign assets. It is a massive economic lifeline.
And the really fascinating part is when you compare this to the status quo right before the war. On February 27th, the Strait of Hormuz was perfectly open, and US and Iranian negotiators were actively discussing a nuclear deal. Fast forward to these new MOU terms, and it's basically just a giant reset. The US paid a phenomenally heavy price in concessions just to get back to the exact same geopolitical reality we had the day before the bombing started. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken actually highlighted this exact frustration online. As he pointed out, the only real achievement here is reopening a strait that was already open. It perfectly captures the stark reality for the administration. They are essentially paying a massive premium to fix something that wasn't even broken until the war began. Section 3. Flawed strategic assumptions. Why the regime didn't fall. To understand how we got here, we have to look at how military planners operated on a dangerously flawed premise. Our sources highlight this kind of lazy assumption that decapitating the leadership, killing the supreme leader, would cause the whole regime to instantly collapse like a Jenga tower. But they completely miss the geopolitical reality. The Islamic Republic's institutions have been meticulously engineered over nearly half a century specifically to survive these exact kinds of decapitation strikes. This resilience runs deep. The survival of the regime isn't just about military hardware or proxy fighters. No, it is deeply rooted in ideology, intense religious conviction, and a deeply ingrained concept of national survival. That mindset was forged in the absolute brutality of their war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq back in the 1980s. You simply cannot bomb away a deeply entrenched ideology overnight. Section 4. The Political Fallout. Broken Promises at Home. Because the reality on the ground didn't match those strategic assumptions, the political fallout has been severe. Take Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He'd spent years trying to persuade US administrations to strike Iran. When it finally happened, he used this intense biblical language, saying he would smite the terror regime hip and thigh. He promised his people a total, decisive victory, but that victory never showed up. So instead of restoring his reputation as Mr. Security, Netanyahu's situation is arguably much worse now. The source material notes his hardline policies failed to deliver the promised collapse, leaving him facing a massive public reckoning from voters for those historic October 7th intelligence failures, all with elections looming in October. It's a similar story for President Trump. He explicitly promised the regime would fall, telling the Iranian people to prepare to take back their country, and even calling for unconditional surrender.
Because neither leader delivered on those enormous promises and actually had to offer massive concessions just to reopen the strait, this conflict has turned into what sources are calling Trump's worst foreign policy blunder yet.
Section 5. A fragile path forward. The nuclear window. So where does this incredibly complex web of concessions and political fallout actually leave us right now? Well, the MOU isn't a final deal. It's literally just an agreement to start talking. We are entering a highly volatile 60-day window specifically for nuclear talks, which can be extended. And let's be real, nobody trusts anyone even a little bit here. Hardliners in Washington, Tehran, and Israel actively want this deal to fail. Any overreach by Israel and Lebanon or by Iran at the negotiating table could blow the whole thing up in an instant. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. We've seen the massive blunders, the incredible loss of life, the devastating economic threats, and the paralyzing distrust on all sides. But this agreement is still arguably better than a devastating global recession. If a nuclear deal is actually reached against all odds, and if both sides somehow keep their promises, could these deeply flawed, chaotic negotiations actually end up transforming the Middle East for the better? It really is the defining question of our time. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.